The millionaire CEO was closing the biggest deal of his career, until he saw two little girls selling toys on the sidewalk, and realized they looked just like him. Mark Bennett didn't believe in distractions. Every morning of his life ran on precision, from the second his alarm went off to the moment he stepped out of his black SUV, briefcase in one hand, phone already in the other. That day was no different. His meeting was set for 12:30 at the most exclusive restaurant in the business district. It wasn't just another deal, it was the kind that could reshape his company's future, a merger that would put him on the cover of more magazines than he could count. He wore a slate gray suit, tailored to perfection, and a watch worth more than some people's cars. His mind was a well-oiled machine of numbers, negotiations, and results. Until, without warning, it stopped. He was halfway through discussing quarterly forecasts with a potential investor when something outside the restaurant window caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a street performer or someone handing out flyers. But when he looked closer, he saw two little girls sitting on the sidewalk just across the street. They couldn't have been older than 6. Identical. Both had long, straight brown hair that caught the sunlight and large, striking green eyes. They were seated on a worn blanket, surrounded by a sad little collection of old toys, stuffed animals missing limbs, faded picture books, dolls with tangled hair. Between them sat a piece of cardboard with a message written in uneven, oversized letters, "Selling toys to help our mom." Mark tried to return to the conversation, but the numbers on the page in front of him blurred. His client's voice faded. Something about those girls made his heart twist in a way that felt unnatural to him, foreign. He told himself to focus. He told himself it wasn't his business. But the girls weren't begging. They weren't making noise or drawing attention. They were just, sitting there, in the heat, patiently waiting, as if it was the most normal thing in the world to sell your toys on a sidewalk to save your mother. He stole another glance through the window. Their faces were solemn but not hopeless. One of them smiled gently at a passerby who paused, then kept walking. The other one hugged a worn-out bunny and rested her chin on her knees. And that's when he felt it, something he hadn't felt in years. Recognition. It wasn't just that they reminded him of someone. It was something deeper. Something in their eyes mirrored his own reflection. Green eyes. The same shape. The same shade. The realization hit him hard and fast, like a memory he wasn't ready to confront. He reached for his glass of water, suddenly uncertain of his voice. The investor across from him continued speaking, unaware that Mark had left the conversation completely. He nodded politely, excused himself under the pretense of taking a call, and walked straight out of the restaurant without looking back. As he stepped into the sun, the city noise surrounded him again, honking cars, distant sirens, laughter from a sidewalk cafe, but all he could hear was the silence that hovered over those two little girls. He crossed the street and stopped a few feet from them. They looked up cautiously, clutching each other's hands. Up close, the resemblance was even more unsettling. Their eyes were his. Not similar. Identical. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, one of the girls stood and pointed at a doll. "She's $2, she said softly, like it was the most important thing in the world. Mark knelt down slowly, still unable to breathe properly. "What are your names?" he asked. "I'm Lily," the girl replied. She gestured to her sister. "And she's Emma. Where's your mom?" His voice barely came out. "In the hospital," Emma said. "We're trying to help her. Do you have anyone else with you?" They shook their heads. Lily looked down at the ground. No one came. Mark felt something inside him shatter. He had built his life around control, around knowing every move before it happened. But nothing in his world had prepared him for this moment, for looking into the faces of two girls who not only needed someone, but who looked like they had come directly from a part of his past he'd never expected to see again. And though he didn't fully understand why yet, one thing was suddenly clear. He couldn't walk away. Not this time. Mark didn't go back to the restaurant. The meeting, the deal, the investor, the projections, none of it seemed to matter now. Instead, he sat on the sidewalk with the two girls, his expensive shoes dusted with the grime of the city, his suit jacket folded beside him. The concrete was warm beneath them. Lily and Emma had stopped holding hands, but they still sat close together, their shoulders touching. He asked them gentle questions, uncertain where to begin. They answered with the honesty only young children could manage. Their mother's name was Rachel. She had gotten very sick and had been taken to the hospital 3 days earlier. At first, a neighbor had stayed with them, but then she had to leave for work. Since then, they'd been on their own, sleeping at the neighbor's place at night and coming back here during the day, hoping someone would notice them. Someone who might care enough to help. Mark listened, the silence inside him growing louder with each word they spoke. They didn't whine. They didn't complain. They just explained, as if selling their toys to strangers was the most natural thing in the world, because no one had told them it wasn't. When Lily mentioned the hospital's name, something clenched in Mark's chest. It wasn't far. He knew the area. He had helped fund renovations there years ago, another philanthropic checkbox, something to bolster the company's public image. But now, for the first time, it felt personal. He bought every toy on the blanket without asking their price. He gave them all back to the girls, tucking the bills into their small hands without fanfare. Then he helped them pack their things, folding the blanket with care as they watched him with cautious curiosity. "Are you going to take us away?" Emma asked, her voice small. Mark shook his head. "No. But I am going to take you somewhere safe." They walked together to the hospital. Mark carried their blanket bag while the girls each held onto one of his hands. As they entered the building, the sterile scent of antiseptic and coffee hit him with a kind of nostalgic dread. He remembered long nights in hospitals when his own father had passed. The coldness. The waiting. The helplessness. It was strange to feel that again, not for himself, but for a woman he hadn't seen in 6 years and 2 little girls who had eyes just like his. At the reception desk, he asked for Rachel by name. The nurse glanced up, cautious. "Are you family?" He hesitated, then said, "I think I might be." That was enough to get him through the doors. Rachel was in the cardiac ICU, pale and still beneath a thin white blanket, her hair damp against her forehead. Machines beeped quietly around her. Mark stood frozen for a moment at the edge of her room. She hadn't changed much, not really. There was something about the curve of her jaw, the way her hands rested lightly on the blanket, that pulled him backward in time. But she looked fragile now, as though one wrong word might cause her to disappear entirely. The girls rushed to her bedside, one on each side, clutching her hands. She didn't wake. The nurse explained that she was stable, but weak. The surgery was scheduled, but not yet guaranteed. Mark asked why. The answer was simple: no insurance coverage, no funds. Without payment, the procedure would be delayed. And delays, the doctor said bluntly, could cost her life. Something shifted in Mark then, a clarity that struck as cleanly as lightning. He stepped into the hallway, took out his phone, and made 3 calls. The first to his lawyer, the second to the hospital's billing department, and the third to a private doctor he trusted completely. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for signatures. He simply said, "Make it happen," and it did. When he returned to the room, the girls had fallen asleep in the chairs beside their mother. He stood at the foot of the bed, watching them breathe, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not power. Not accomplishment. But connection. A raw, unspoken truth that these girls, these lives, had come from a moment he had left behind. A moment he had never stopped carrying, even if he hadn't known it until now. He sat down, took a breath, and stayed. For the first time in a very long time, Mark Bennett didn't look at his watch. He looked at them. And it was enough. The following morning, the light in the hospital room was softer, filtering through the pale blue curtains like a quiet promise. Mark hadn't gone home. He had spent the night in a stiff chair just outside the girl's room, speaking in hushed tones with doctors and nurses, reviewing treatment options and signing forms. A specialist had been called in overnight, and the surgery was confirmed for the next morning. Everything was being expedited. Money was no longer the obstacle. The only question left was time. Rachel had stirred once in the early hours. Her eyes barely opened, unfocused, and her lips moved in a whisper Mark couldn't make out. The nurse reassured him that it was a good sign, that her body was beginning to respond, even in sleep. But for Mark, just seeing her face again, pale but real, was enough to shake loose everything he had buried in the years since they'd parted. He remembered her laughter, sharp and unexpected, the way she had once told him he worked so hard to avoid feeling anything real. At the time, he'd shrugged it off, too focused on deadlines and ambition to realize she had been right. Rachel had wanted more than he was willing to give, and rather than meet her halfway, he had let her go. It had seemed like the mature thing then, clean, logical, detached. But now, sitting in the quiet hum of a hospital room beside the two little girls she had raised on her own, he understood what a coward he'd been. Lily and Emma woke up curled against each other in the hospital chairs. They blinked slowly, adjusting to the light, and when they saw Mark still there, a flicker of surprise passed across their faces. He offered them a small smile and handed them each a juice box he'd picked up from the nurse's station. They didn't ask why he hadn't left. They simply accepted the drinks and sat beside him, one on each side, as if he'd always been there. That morning, a social worker arrived. Her name was Dana, a calm woman with gray-streaked hair and steady eyes. She sat with Mark in a small consultation room down the hall and asked questions, about his relationship with Rachel, about his understanding of the girl's situation, about his intentions. Mark didn't sugarcoat anything. He told her he hadn't known about the children, that Rachel had kept it from him, and that he didn't blame her. He explained how he'd found the girls by accident, how he'd paid for the medical bills, and how he had no idea what came next except that he wasn't going to abandon them. Dana listened without interrupting. She took notes, nodding slowly, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she asked him one question that caught him off guard. "Are you ready to be a father, Mr. Bennett?" He could have said no. He could have said he wasn't sure, that he hadn't even had time to think about it. But instead, he looked her in the eye and said quietly, "I don't know if I'm ready. But I'm staying. And I'll learn." That, it seemed, was enough for her, for now. Later, when he returned to the room, the girls were sitting on either side of Rachel, coloring in books a nurse had brought in. They looked up as he entered. Emma tilted her head. "You came back again." "I didn't leave," he said, and walked over slowly. "Can I sit with you?" They nodded. Lily scooted closer to make room. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb the tangle of wires and tubes that surrounded Rachel. She didn't stir. But her hand moved ever so slightly, just enough to brush against his. He didn't pull away. In that moment, Mark stopped thinking about what he'd missed, what he should have done differently, or what the media would say if they found out the CEO of a multi-million-dollar firm had spent the week in a children's wing of a hospital. None of it mattered. Not compared to the quiet breathing of the girls beside him, or the soft warmth of Rachel's fingers against his. He stayed like that for a long time, with no plan, no exit strategy, just a quiet, unfamiliar sense that maybe, for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he needed to be. The morning of Rachel's surgery began before the sun rose. The hospital was quiet in that way only hospitals can be, restless, but hushed. The fluorescent lights in the hallways cast a dim glow on the floor as nurses moved through the corridors with the efficiency of people who'd done this 1,000 times. In room 312, the stillness was different. It was heavy with anticipation and something more fragile, hope. Mark hadn't slept much. He had sat through the night in the same chair, watching the rise and fall of Rachel's chest, counting the seconds between each beep of the monitor, memorizing the way the girls breathed when they finally fell asleep curled up on a cot near their mother's bed. Around 5 a.m., a nurse gently woke him and told him they'd be moving Rachel to pre-op shortly. She spoke in a quiet voice, but her words felt louder than anything Mark had heard in days. He stood up slowly, his muscles aching from tension and too many hours in the same position, and turned toward the girls. Lily stirred first, sitting up with a yawn and blinking sleep from her eyes. Emma followed seconds later, reaching immediately for her sister's hand. When they realized what was happening, they didn't cry. They didn't panic. They walked up to the bed, took their mother's hand, and whispered something Mark couldn't hear. Rachel, still only half conscious, gave the slightest squeeze in return. It was enough for them. Mark watched them and realized these girls had grown up in a world where strength had to be quiet, where comfort came in soft gestures instead of loud reassurances. The medical team entered and began the process of moving Rachel. Mark stayed close, holding the girls back gently as the gurney rolled away. They followed it down the hallway in silence, walking on either side of him. When they reached the operating floor, the nurses ushered the girls into a waiting room, and Mark promised he'd stay with them until it was over. The surgery was expected to last 4 hours. For the first hour, they colored pictures on a flimsy hospital table. Then they played a quiet game of I Spy near the window. But as time wore on, the silence returned, and the weight of the unknown settled again. Mark sat between them, his arms stretched across the back of the couch, their small bodies leaning into his sides. He didn't try to distract them with false optimism. Instead, he let them be afraid, and he let them know he was there. A nurse brought updates when she could, stable vitals, procedure progressing, the team was working carefully. Each time, Mark nodded, and the girls listened intently. They had learned to hold on to every small sign of progress, to measure safety in measured updates instead of promises. When the doctor finally walked into the room near noon, he looked tired but calm. He motioned for Mark to step aside, and the girls watched with wide eyes as the two men spoke quietly. The surgery had gone well. No complications. Rachel would need time to recover, but the worst was over. Mark exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. He knelt beside the girls, and this time he let himself smile. "She's okay," he said softly. "She made it." Lily's lips quivered, and Emma buried her face in his shoulder. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. Mark wrapped his arms around them both and held them there, grounded by the realization that this moment, this quiet, teary moment of relief, meant more to him than any deal, any accolade, any number in a bank account. Later, once Rachel was settled in recovery and the girls were finally allowed to see her for a few minutes, they held her hands gently and whispered stories of what they'd done while she was asleep. Rachel couldn't say much, but she looked at Mark, her eyes full of something heavy and unspoken. Gratitude. Guilt. Relief. He sat beside her, one hand on her blanket-covered arm, the other resting lightly on the edge of the hospital bed. "I'm here," he said simply. "For them. And for you." Rachel blinked slowly, and her lips curved in the faintest smile. And in that small, fragile moment, something inside Mark shifted. He had come to this place by accident, but he was no longer acting out of obligation or surprise. He was choosing this. Choosing them. Choosing a life where presence mattered more than control, where love looked like showing up every single day, not just when it was convenient, but when it was hardest. For the first time, it didn't feel like he was saving anyone. It felt like he was being saved too. Rachel's recovery was slow, but steady. She remained in the hospital for several more days, monitored closely by doctors and surrounded by the quiet chaos of machines, wires, and nurses moving in and out of her room with careful hands and calm voices. During those days, Mark didn't leave. He brought the girls to visit every morning, stayed through the afternoons, and tucked them into the cot by her bedside every night. He slept on the recliner in the corner of the room, not because he had to, but because being anywhere else felt wrong. For the first time in years, his schedule wasn't dictated by meetings or markets, but by school drop-offs, meal trays, and whispered bedtime stories. One afternoon, while Rachel was asleep and the girls were playing quietly with a deck of mismatched cards on the floor, a hospital administrator stopped by with a folder full of paperwork. It contained discharge planning documents, insurance statements, and a formal notice regarding the children's temporary guardianship. Mark signed everything without hesitation. When asked if he intended to take the girls home with him after Rachel was released, he looked up and said, without a trace of doubt, "They're already home with me." He found a small rental house on a quiet street just a few miles from the hospital. It wasn't anything like his penthouse apartment downtown. There were no floor-to-ceiling windows or imported countertops, but it had a yard, 3 small bedrooms, and sunlight that poured through the kitchen in the mornings. He brought the girls there the day before Rachel was discharged, letting them explore while he unpacked a few borrowed dishes and assembled their bunk bed by trial and error. They ran from room to room with uncontainable energy, choosing their spaces, naming corners of the house with imaginative titles like Unicorn Forest and Princess Library. Mark watched them with quiet wonder, overwhelmed by how naturally they brought life into a place that had been empty just hours earlier. When Rachel finally came home, she moved slowly, carefully, her strength returning in increments. The girls helped in every way they could, bringing her water, folding blankets, whispering jokes to make her smile. Mark stayed nearby, handling groceries, medicine schedules, and meals that ranged from barely edible to surprisingly decent. He burned the first few dinners but got better quickly. The kitchen became a space of laughter and learning, not perfection. Sometimes Rachel would sit at the table and watch him fumble through recipes, shaking her head with a tired but amused smile. She didn't say it out loud, but she didn't have to. He was doing more than she ever thought he would. They didn't talk much at first about the past. It hung in the air between them like a closed door they both knew was there but weren't ready to open. Instead, they focused on the now, on Lily's fascination with dinosaurs, on Emma's nightly insistence on a story with a dragon, on finding the right toothpaste flavor that didn't make either of them gag. It was in these small, ordinary choices that something new was being built. Not a replacement for what was lost, but a beginning. One night, after the girls had fallen asleep, Mark found Rachel sitting on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes on the moon. He joined her in silence, unsure if speaking would shatter the fragile peace between them. But she spoke first, her voice low and steady. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to ruin your life." He looked at her for a long time before answering. "But it turns out they're the ones who saved it." Rachel turned toward him then, and in the dim light, he saw her eyes shine, not with tears, but with the weight of everything they hadn't said. She reached for his hand. He let her take it. There were no promises made that night, no grand confessions or declarations. Just 2 people, sitting side by side, watching over the life they'd created, not on purpose, but with purpose now. And in that quiet, Mark felt something settle deep in his chest. Not the high of a victory or the thrill of a deal, but something warmer, something still and real. He wasn't fixing the past. He was finally showing up for the future. Spring arrived with warmth that felt almost undeserved. The trees in the neighborhood burst into bloom, and the smell of fresh-cut grass drifted through the open windows of the small rental house. Mark had begun to develop habits that surprised even himself, early grocery runs where he actually remembered everything on the list, school pickups where Lily and Emma would race to see who could hug him first, late-night trips to the pharmacy for cough syrup and strawberry toothpaste. His days were no longer dictated by his phone or calendar, but by the rhythm of 2 little girls who woke up giggling and fell asleep tangled in blankets they insisted on sharing, even though they had separate beds. He hadn't known it was possible to love the sound of tiny feet running through a hallway, or the chaos of mismatched socks in the laundry. But somehow, it had all become the new normal, and he wouldn't have traded it for anything. Rachel was healing well. Her strength returned in quiet milestones, her first walk down the block, the day she made breakfast without assistance, the evening she read to the girls from their favorite book without needing to pause for breath. She still moved carefully, still had bad days, but she was present. Fully. And with that presence came an unexpected ease between her and Mark. They talked more now, not about what had gone wrong years ago, but about how to move forward. He didn't push, and she didn't shut him out. The foundation they were building was cautious but honest, and that was enough for both of them. One weekend afternoon, they hosted a small barbecue in the backyard. Just the four of them, a plastic kiddie pool filled with water, a paper plate of overcooked hot dogs, and a folding table with markers and glitter glue scattered across it. The girls made friendship crowns out of construction paper and declared everyone in the house part of the royal Bennett family. Mark wore his crown all day. Rachel laughed so hard she cried when it slipped down into his eyes while he was grilling. Later that night, after the girls were asleep, Rachel pulled out a small envelope and handed it to Mark. Inside were printed forms, guardianship papers she had started before the surgery, long before she knew if she would survive. At the bottom was a note in her handwriting, "If I can't stay, please don't leave them." She had never meant for him to see it, not if she had lived. But now that she had, she said it felt right to share. Mark held the papers for a long time, his fingers tracing the edge of the signature line. "You don't have to prove anything to me," she said softly, her voice steady. "But I know what you've already proven to them." The next day, Mark contacted his attorney and began the process of filing for joint legal custody, not because Rachel couldn't care for the girls, but because he could now. Because he wanted to be part of every school forum, every parent-teacher meeting, every scraped knee and piano recital. Because he had missed 6 years, and he wasn't going to miss anything else. Weeks passed. Rachel returned to work part-time as a freelance illustrator, setting up a small studio in the corner of the living room. The girls settled into school routines, brought home friendship bracelets and macaroni art. Mark started taking calls again, slowly reconnecting with the business world, but he set boundaries now. No travel unless absolutely necessary. No meetings during dinner. No working on Sundays. For the first time, the people around him at work began to see a version of him that wasn't polished or untouchable, but grounded and unexpectedly joyful. One evening, Lily and Emma found an old photo album in a box Rachel had brought down from the attic. They flipped through pictures of her younger years, asking endless questions. Who was that? Why was your hair like that? How come we don't know these people? Mark sat beside them, smiling, until Emma pointed to a picture of Rachel and Mark from years ago. It was at a holiday party, long before anything serious, long before decisions that changed everything. Were you in love? Emma asked, tilting her head. Rachel looked at Mark. He looked at her. We were, figuring things out, Rachel said with a smile that didn't try to hide the truth. Emma seemed satisfied with that. Lily just nodded and said, well, we love you both. So that works. And somehow, it did. Because in this new version of their life, love didn't have to look like it did in stories or in old photographs. It looked like warm breakfasts and held hands. Like school drop-offs and inside jokes. Like starting over, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And in that choice, Mark found something he hadn't even known he was missing, peace, not with what had happened, but with what was now growing in its place. By the time summer arrived, the house had transformed. Not in the way most people noticed, there were no expensive renovations, no new furniture, no signs of wealth scattered around. But everything about the space felt lived in and loved. The hallway walls were lined with framed drawings, some proudly crooked, others covered in glitter and stickers. The fridge door was a collage of report cards, notes from school, and grocery lists written in messy, colorful handwriting. The backyard was half garden, half playground, with tomato vines growing beside plastic slides and chalk drawings that reappeared after every rainfall. It was no longer a temporary home. It was theirs. Mark had found his rhythm. His morning started with Lily tugging on his sleeve asking for pancakes or cereal, depending on the phase she was in that week. Emma would follow, already dressed and brushing her doll's hair at the kitchen table, waiting for someone to pack her lunchbox even though she insisted on supervising every detail. Mark learned to multitask with a kind of grace he never thought possible. He could flip pancakes while reviewing an email on his phone and still catch a spilled juice box before it hit the floor. His suits had been replaced by soft t-shirts and well-worn jeans, and he hadn't worn a tie in months. Rachel was stronger now. Her recovery was nearly complete, and with that strength came a new kind of energy between them. They laughed more. They argued sometimes, mostly about small things: how many cookies were too many, whether or not it was okay to let the girls stay up late on Fridays, but underneath it all, there was an understanding. They were figuring out how to parent together, how to coexist with a shared history and a very present reality. It wasn't always easy, but it was honest. One Saturday morning, the girls asked to have a lemonade stand. It wasn't about money. They had seen it in a cartoon and decided it was the ultimate summer activity. Rachel helped them make a bright yellow sign, and Mark dug an old folding table out of the garage. They set everything up on the sidewalk in front of the house with 2 pitchers of lemonade, paper cups, and a tip jar decorated in glitter glue and smiley faces. The girls wore sunglasses and flower crowns and shouted at every passing neighbor with dramatic flair. People stopped. Neighbors, delivery drivers, joggers. Everyone who bought a cup was met with a thank you card scribbled in marker. Mark sat on the porch watching them, his chest full of a feeling that had no name but felt a lot like happiness. At some point, Rachel joined him, a mug of coffee in her hands and a quiet smile on her face. They watched the girls together, and for a while, neither said anything. Then Rachel turned to him and said, softly but clearly, "You know they adore you." Mark looked at her, surprised, not by the truth of the statement, but by how much it meant to hear it. "I adore them, too," he said. "Every bit of them." She nodded and looked back at the girls. "I never imagined this life. Not like this. But I think I like it more than the one I planned." They spent the rest of the afternoon outside, drinking lemonade that was far too sweet and helping the girls count their tip money even though they'd already decided to spend it on stickers and popsicles. As the sun began to set, they packed up the table and headed inside. Mark carried Emma on his shoulders while Rachel walked beside Lily, their hands swinging between them. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep in a tangle of sheets and storybooks, Mark stood at the door of their room for a long time. He watched their peaceful breathing, the soft rise and fall of their small chests, and something settled deep in his heart. This wasn't the life he had been chasing when he was younger. It wasn't built on power or control. It didn't come with awards or headlines. But it was steady. It was real. And every piece of it had been earned, not with money, but with love, patience, and the quiet decision to stay when it would have been easier to walk away. He turned off the light, closed the door behind him, and found Rachel waiting in the hallway. She didn't say anything. She just reached for his hand, and together they walked into the soft, quiet glow of the living room. The house was still. The world outside moved on. But inside, in that moment, everything that mattered was already right there. August rolled in slowly, with golden evenings and the smell of cut grass lingering in the air long after sunset. The days felt unhurried, filled with sidewalk chalk masterpieces, backyard dinners, and nightly routines that had become second nature. There was a quiet sense of rhythm in the house now, a heartbeat they all seemed to follow without needing to say anything out loud. The girls had stopped asking what would happen next or whether Mark was staying. They no longer checked for him in the mornings or looked over their shoulders when he left the room. He was just there. Constant. Present. And that, more than anything, had changed everything. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail, addressed to Mark in familiar handwriting. It was from his assistant at the firm, someone he hadn't spoken to in weeks. The letter wasn't urgent, it was reflective, a summary of what had happened in his absence. The company was doing well. Deals had gone through. His name still carried weight. They wanted to know when he might return, if he was planning to reclaim the position he had built from the ground up. Mark folded the letter carefully and slid it into a drawer without answering. He hadn't decided what came next, but he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't going back to the way things were. Not entirely. That night, after dinner and stories and goodnight kisses, he sat in the backyard with Rachel. The string lights above them swayed gently in the breeze, casting a warm glow over the patio. Rachel was curled into a chair, her legs tucked beneath her, sipping chamomile tea. Mark leaned back, looking up at the stars. Neither of them spoke for a while, content in the kind of silence that feels full rather than empty. Eventually, Rachel looked over and said, "Do you miss it?" He knew what she meant. The power, the attention, the pace of his old life. He thought about it honestly. He missed parts of it. The clarity. The feeling of momentum. The thrill of solving something complicated. But he didn't miss what it had cost him. And he didn't miss who he had to become in order to live it. "I miss pieces," he said eventually. "But not enough to trade what I have now." Rachel smiled faintly, looking down into her cup. "I never thought you'd say that." "Neither did I," he admitted, and they both laughed softly. In the weeks that followed, the new school year approached. The girls picked out backpacks with cartoon foxes and glitter straps. They made supply lists and packed their lunchboxes days in advance, practicing how to zip them closed like it was a race. Mark walked them to the school on orientation day, holding each of their hands as they approached the wide glass doors. When the girls rushed ahead into the crowd of chattering children, he stood beside Rachel and watched them disappear into their classroom. She slipped her hand into his and squeezed. "They're going to be okay," she said, not as a question, but as a quiet truth. Back home that afternoon, the house felt a little too quiet. Mark wandered through the rooms, noticing the way the morning light now fell across the floor differently without toys scattered in its path. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, then opened the drawer where the letter from his assistant still sat. This time, he didn't ignore it. He pulled it out, read it once more, then turned it over and began writing a reply. He wasn't coming back full-time. But he was ready to help in a different way, on his terms, with balance, without the cost of missing more moments than he could afford. He signed it, folded it, and felt no regret. That evening, they ate outside again, just the four of them. The girls told stories about their new classmates, exaggerated every detail, and laughed until they spilled lemonade down their shirts. Rachel shook her head but didn't stop smiling. Mark leaned back in his chair, watching the sky turn pink above them, and thought about everything that had changed, not just around him, but within him. He had gone from a man who measured his worth in quarterly gains and stock performance to someone who found purpose in bedtime routines and Sunday pancake races. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been clean. But it had been real. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not the empire he'd once ruled, but the life he'd built when everything else fell away. A life that began the moment he saw two little girls selling toys beneath a summer sun, and chose, for the first time, to stay. What makes the ending of this story so quietly powerful is that it doesn't need a grand gesture or dramatic twist to feel complete. Instead, it leans into the kind of transformation that happens slowly, moment by moment, choice by choice. Mark doesn't become a hero by saving the girls or fixing everything overnight. He becomes one by staying, by listening, by choosing presence over ambition and connection over control. And in doing that, he rewrites not just his legacy, but his identity. I think the most beautiful part is how love is portrayed, not as an instant, magical solution, but as a daily commitment. The story respects the messiness of second chances. It doesn't pretend the past didn't happen, but it also doesn't let it define the future. Mark learns that being a parent, a partner, and a whole person isn't about being perfect, it's about being there when it counts. For me, the ending lands with quiet impact because it reflects something so true about real life. Sometimes the most meaningful redemption arc isn't loud or cinematic. Sometimes it's a man packing lunchboxes, braiding hair badly, and choosing to stay every single day. And that, in the end, is what makes it unforgettable.